Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of The Pen Habit. My name's Matt. I am glad to have you back for this review. Now this review is something a little different than I've done before and something that was completely unexpected. So when Pen Habit viewer James reached out to me and said, hey, I've got this unusual Pelikan pen from the German manufacturer Pelikan. Would you be interested in reviewing it? I thought, I've never seen anything quite like this before. Yes, as a matter of fact, I would. So he sent it to me, which was very trusting of him. So thank you, James. For review purposes, I'm going to be sending it back to him shortly after I record this review for a couple reasons. You'll see why in just a moment. So the pen in question is Pelikan's 2008 limited edition pen, The Calculation of Times. This was something pretty unusual for Pelikan because normally their limited editions they've got very standard designs. Pelikan's designs have remained largely unchanged for decades and decades. They will occasionally add a new material in here or there or change the nibs, that sort of thing. But for the most part, they don't make a lot of significant changes to their line. Their limited editions are usually things like and these aren't limited, more like special editions, things like the brown tortoise M800 or the pink version of the M600 that came out, or the colors of the year that they do in the M200 line. It's pretty unusual for them to do these weird limited editions like you see for Mont Blanc or Visconti, for instance. And that's what this is. So here's the box it comes in. It is a big monstrosity of a box. Piano hinges on the back here and a little latch on the front. And you open it up and inside, out of all this big old box, I'm going to move the pen out of the way just so you can see, there's just one little depression for the pen and that's about it. Under the lid, there's a nice book and a certificate about the pen itself, kind of telling the story of the pen. But for the most part, it's just this big old tray and then the limited edition number right there. So I'm going to set this aside, and now we're going to talk about the pen. Now, if you know Pelikan pens, you know their designs really well, and I wish I had one in here so I could show you a comparison. But let me switch over to the overhead camera and show you. This is not your standard Pelikan design. So here you go. This is the Pelikan Calculation of Times, and it is an odd duck of a pen. So it starts right up here at the top. You've got the Pelikan design in the top of the cap, and then around it are the cycles of the moon. And this kind of starts telling the story that this pen is meant to depict, which is kind of man's journey through how we defined time and codified time and calculated time, ergo the name, over the centuries. So obviously, you know, the cycles of the moon was one of the first ways that man kind of set a schedule to the rhythm of nature. It's gold-plated hardware, and then the clip is this kind of unusual swooping design, very uncommon for Pelikan, which generally tends to go with a pelican bill shaped clip. So this is very unusual for them. What's kind of interesting, and I don't know how well it will show up on the video here, is on the face of the resin here is engraved a sun and then all of the settings for a sundial all the way around the outside. And the clip itself is the 12 o'clock position on the sundial. So it may be a little tricky to see, and maybe the photos will show up a bit better, and I'll try to cut some in here. But there's the sundial there to kind of show the hours of the day. Kind of an interesting note is the color of this material. It's I call it builder's beige, and if you're familiar with the real estate market, especially here in the United States, you know this color. It is the kind of blah standard color that is in every home from every builder ever built in the last 25 years. It's usually the first thing that you paint over when you move into a house and want to start adding a little personality. It's a very unusual color for pens to be made out of. Personally, I don't like it at all. I mean, look at my shirt, for crying out loud. I like color. But, you know, and when I first saw this, I thought, why in the world would anyone make a pen this color? And then I took the pen with me to the Seattle-ish Pen Posse meetup and showed it around to a few folks, and some of them were just absolutely in love with this taupe color that the pen's made out of. I personally don't get it, and combined with all the gold color on this pen, I think it doesn't work for me. As just an aesthetic whole, it feels really over the top. Along the bottom of the cap, there is another gold band that just says Pelikan and then Germany here. Then we get to the barrel of the pen. Now, the barrel of the pen is, I think, really fascinating, just from a historical standpoint. So what they've done is they have incorporated the Gregorian calendar, so the 12-month calendar, but they've taken depictions from the Middle Ages. So instead of, January, February, it's Januarius, Februarius, Martius, Aprus. I can't read that very well in this light. Yeah, Aprius. So it's kind of taking these Middle Age names and showing depictions here. It looks like it is probably laser etched in here. Very intricate, fascinating to look at. I've found myself spinning this pen in my hands and looking at the barrel. It's not something I think is particularly attractive, but it is really fascinating. And that there's some value in that too. Then you come down here, the pen tapers down a little bit, and you come down to this kind of cone-shaped piston knob. This is a piston-filled pen with a little gold finial on the bottom, and then on the bottom there are the number of the pen. This is a limited edition, a numbered limited edition, and this is 760 pieces, and that is meant to kind of represent the start of the modern Christian calendar, which was put into place with the birth of Jesus 760 years after the founding of Rome. So all in all, the pen does a pretty good, yet pretty explicit, some would even say blatant, job of telling the story that they were wanting to tell. Now, I've in the past complained about pens. The Visconti Saturno is an example of this, where the design inspiration was so tenuous that the only way you would know what the design inspiration was if someone explained it to you. This pen goes way the other direction and is just so explicit and so blatant that it feels a little forced. It doesn't feel like it influenced the design much, but it felt like they're just saying, well, we'll add this thing and add this thing and add this thing and add this thing. And it doesn't really form a cohesive whole for me. Anyway, the cap comes off on very smooth threads. It's only, half a turn? Yeah, about half a turn to come off. Underneath, you've got a very short section of that same beige or taupe material and this really lovely nib. So this is an 18 karat gold nib. It is then embossed with this sun motif in the center, right around the breather hole, and the number 12 in Roman numerals, and those are plated in rhodium. It's really quite a lovely nib. One of the more attractive nibs I've seen. It's very bold and graphic, but it feels nice. It's got a really nice look to it all the way around. Now, the one thing I will say is this nib looks a little different to me than nibs on a lot of the Pelikan standard line. It looks a little bit more standard shaped, like a regular number 6 nib. Now, that could be just the overall proportions of the pen making the nib look a little different. This is right in that era where we're not really sure when nib manufacturing moved back into Pelikan, but around 2008, about the time this pen came out, people were starting to say, yeah, I'm starting to hear from Pelikan customer service or from ChartPack, the US distributor for Pelikan, that they manufacture their nibs in-house. So, and it may be that this is one that was manufactured or wasn't. It's really hard to say. In any case, I'll get to how the nib writes in just a little bit. So this is a very heavy pen. With a barrel with this much metal on it, it's kind of to be expected. The section is pretty small, and so you have to be careful where you hold it. I find myself gripping the threads, which aren't very sharp, or the step down, which again is not particularly steep. But even still, if I don't want to hold it down here, I find myself on the threads, which makes it for a slightly uncomfortable grip. I also find, because the weight of this pen is very much right here in the center of the pen, that the balance feels a little weird to me. Normally I like the weight of the pen to be more toward the bottom, toward the nib, so it just kind of settles into the hand. This feels a little off weight. The pen can be posted. I'm not going to post it really deep, but it posts pretty deeply, and it actually helps the balance a little bit. Not a lot. It still feels slightly off, but it's not too long to use posted if you wanted to. So there you go. All right, so this is the Pelikan calculation of times. As I mentioned, it is a piston filler, has a pretty large ink capacity. So let me go ahead and show you the measurements, and then I'm going to show you how this thing writes. In reviews past, I've talked a lot about Pelikan's nibs and how, for some reason, they tend to run really, really wide for their nib designation. They also tend to run a little bit on the stubby side, especially when you get into some of these broader gauges. Such is very true with this nib. So you can notice here, here's the downstrokes, here are the cross strokes. This is almost a stub nib. Now this is a broad. This was, just a factory broad, but it's a very, very broad. And that's pretty much in keeping with how Pelikan tends to grind their nibs. It's very smooth. It's pretty low on the feedback scale too. Because this is so stubby, depending on whether or not I tend to roll the pen a little bit, it's either like a 2 or a 3 on the feedback scale. Since I do tend to roll my pen a little bit like this, I do sometimes snag the corners just a little bit when I write. So if I remember to keep the nib straight onto the paper or, like this, then it's okay. But otherwise, it does tend to get just a little tiny bit of feedback. Now, I've had this pen inked for a couple months now, and I've cleaned it out once, re-inked it with a different ink with the Pilot Blue that I've got in here now, and I've left it unused for the last 3 weeks because I always do this to make sure that the pens, how they handle. This wrote straight out of removing the cap. I didn't have to prime it. I didn't have to flick the ink out or anything to get the ink going. It just worked right away. I haven't had any ink starvation problems, any baby's bottom. It is really quite a very nice, lovely, wet nib. It's not the wettest nib in the world, but this is also not the wettest ink in the world either. It's a good ink, but it's not super wet. So, it's a nice moderate wetness, but the feed seems to be perfectly capable of keeping up with that moderate wetness on this really, really broad nib. I think if I were to put a wetter ink in here, and this pen may be pretty close to empty. I've used it quite a bit in the last little while, so there's no way of telling. There's no ink window on the pen, so I don't know exactly how much ink is in here. I think with a wetter ink in here, I'm thinking of something like Deatramentis Aubergine. This pen would be something of a gusher, but in a good way. In terms of reverse writing, it's a decent reverse writer. It's even more stub-like, I think, on the reverse side. It's actually pretty good. I'd say this is like a medium stub or even a fine stub. And if I had to guess what the gauge is, if this were supposed to be a stub, I'd say this is probably a 0.9, 1.0 millimeter stub. So, it is pretty squared off for a round nib. That's something that I find pretty common among a lot of Pelikan's pens. Aside from that, I really like the way this writes. It's not the most comfortable pen in the hand for me, but it writes so well and so consistently, and it's something of a conversation piece, which I like. And if you like pens that tell a story, this one really does tell its story well. So in that particular case, I think it's a success. Now, overall, the colors, I'm so on. I could see why people would like them, and there aren't a lot of taupe pens out there. This one just, I don't think, is the right one for me, color-wise. As this is a limited edition pen, it's a little difficult to put a value on it because these aren't really available on the primary market anymore. You're mostly going to find these on the secondary market. So people who bought them for collector purposes and are reselling them, that sort of thing. I did find one for sale on Amazon, and it was listed at $1,700. Now that seems a little high to me. Actually, it seems a lot high to me. That may be just one of those, hey, we know this isn't available anymore, we're going to put it up on Amazon. And for these high-end pens, I find that Amazon's generally not the place to get the best prices. So I can't really tell you what the pen costs. I think you just have to go see if you can find it through one of the secondary markets at a pen show or a Pelikan collector, that sort of thing. It's really interesting. It's very unusual for Pelikan. I've never seen anything quite like this from them. They may have more of them, but if they do, their limited editions are just not particularly well published. Now, would I pay $1,700 for this pen? No, I would not. I don't like this enough to pay $1,700 for it, and honestly, I'm not sure I like any pen enough to pay that much money. Those sound like famous last words, I know. I'm sure a time will come where I'll be like, $1,700? Sure, why not? But that time is not now, and it's certainly not with this pen. It's a nice pen, I just don't think it's the right fit for me. So, that has been my review of the Pelikan Calculation of Times. James, thanks again for letting me borrow this pen for review. It's been a treat to see something so different from such a well-known brand. I don't get to see things like that very often, so I really do appreciate it. And I hope you have enjoyed this video and all the other videos here at The Pen Habit. I do appreciate you joining us and your comments and your feedback and your interactions and participations. Don't forget to head over to penhabit.com, check out the photos, maybe pick up a few Inky Fingers notebooks, and we will see you here next time on The Pen Habit. Thanks for watching. Bye.